Loren, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
The pleasure.
Cool. So I think we get right into it. The idea here is for you to help us understand the history of Xenowatch, its origins, and where we are going as a project. And I think the first question to you is for you to briefly maybe unpack to us to tell us how did Xenowatch started, what motivated ACMS to develop this project or this platform that focuses on looking into issues of xenophobic discrimination in South Africa.
Right. But we have unfortunately, it comes from a long history, and that's a long history of anti-outsider xenophobic violence, something that we as a center started studying in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, and particularly in 2007 when things were ramping up. Then in 2008, there was the sort of first mass attack, hundreds of thousands of people displaced, dozens of people killed. And we realized at that time that we didn't have a systematic understanding of what was going on. It was seen as a phenomenon, but the incidents were studied in isolation. So we decided we needed something to try to understand why we are seeing this violence, when we are seeing it, who are the targets, who are the perpetrators, what were the social conditions that would lead to it. So borrowing from some of the new crowdsourcing technologies that we'd seen elsewhere in the world, we set this up with the idea that it would help us develop an early warning system, but most importantly, it would really help us understand the phenomenon so that it could feed into, one, efforts to hold people accountable, the police and perpetrators, but two, that it could feed into initiatives to try to address preemptively the violence, which would ultimately make everybody safer.
Yeah. And what would you say were your biggest challenges? Because I'm sure, I mean, like, as you say, during the time, like it was motivated after the 2008 xenophobic attacks, and obviously the climate wasn't really great at that time. So when you were setting up the Xenowatch project, what were the challenges that you say you faced during that period, if any?
Well, yes, there's plenty, of course. Some are just technical logistical challenges of how to build something like this, which we had never done before. But those, I think, were secondary compared to the broader challenges which we faced in trying to deal with xenophobic violence more generally, which is that there is a lack of support or buy-in from government, from civil society, and in some ways even an unwillingness to accept that this is a phenomenon that exists, and even if it exists, that it is big enough to be worth studying. And it's something we have continued to face. The fact that we have xenophobia in our name, I think, is a shame for people. But in some ways, as anti-immigrant sentiments have become more mainstream, less something from the margins, but something at the very center of politics, it's really impossible for officials and others to accept that this is something that is important, because it's seen that we are working to defend the rights, the welfare, the security of immigrants, when South African politics at the time is about getting those people out of the country, which is something that many of the vigilantes and the perpetrators say exactly that they're trying to do. So at one level, it makes this initiative more important than ever, because there are not other voices out there doing this kind of work and continuing to flag that this is happening. But it also makes it harder than ever to get the funding and to get the ears we need to respond to what's going on.
Yeah. And now that, I mean, I think it's how many years later? I think Xenowatch was first launched in 2016. I think it's almost
10, let's say.
Almost 10 years later. Yeah, almost 10 years later. How would you say the project has evolved? And also given the political landscape, I mean, I'm sure things are different now from when we started the project, right? So how have you seen, one, the project shift itself, and then two, also, in terms of how xenophobia has morphed over the years to where we are right now?
Yeah, I mean, those are big questions. I think in terms of the research, it was set up at a time when things were very acute. There was a real sense that there was a need to do something about the issues. And even though the issues haven't gone away, I think some of that political popular interest in addressing it certainly has, and that has made the work harder. On the upside, I think over the past decade, with the help of you and others, of course, we've developed a database and contacts which actually allow us to understand the phenomenon in a much better way, to speak about it with the level of nuance and precision that wasn't there before, and to make that data, those data available to researchers within the center or outside of the center who are really interested in understanding the phenomenon and ultimately trying to address it. But as I mentioned before, the fundamental challenge is that we are continuing to highlight that there is an issue and there is no political will or political interest in addressing it.
Yeah. And then I know you don't work on the project on a day-to-day basis, but like you play a key role in terms of like the strategic overview in terms of how do we move forward and how do we look at these issues within the South African context. So I just wanted to ask you, just from the time that the project started, what do you think? You touched on a bit on some of them in different ways in your previous response, but what would you say are the significant milestones that we've been able to achieve as a project so far?
I think, one of the original goals was to hold government accountable, to hold others accountable, including the International Organization of Migration or the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And while we haven't seen a massive amount of their behavior changing, I think our ability to continue to put out reports, to continue to illustrate the ineffectiveness or the effectiveness of certain initiatives to address these, to highlight the risks that certain types of political speech or certain types of interventions might have, is an enormously valuable thing. And I don't know that as an organization or as an initiative working at the intersection of activism and scholarship, we can expect to see that people will love us or that they will embrace what we have to say, nor can we hold ourselves to the standard that by saying it and it doesn't fix things that we've failed. I think our success is that we're still here and we're still speaking about these issues when civil society, government, etc., has moved on, leaving thousands of people vulnerable to violence, both South Africans and foreigners.
Yeah. And in addition to that, like, what would you say have been the unexpected lessons or insights that you've learned so far from the data that we've collected through XenoWatch over the years?
So I think there's both kind of substantive or kind of analytical insights, and then there are the more political insights. And from the analytical side, I think what the data have really helped us demonstrate is the particularities, the spatiality, the way in which this sort of violence, even though it is part of a national phenomenon rooted in nationalist speech, political speech, which is now national, how much these things are rooted in local politics. And that in itself has given us insight into the nature of South African politics, which most people are not speaking about, the ways in which townships are governed, the kind of interrelationship between mobility, ethnicity, class, political party affiliation or non-affiliation, how all of these things work together gives us a fine-grained, granular sort of insight into politics, which unsettles the bigger conversations about this is about poverty, this is about global capitalism, this is legacies of race or Afrophobia. We can say so much more about the nature of South African politics. I don't think we've said enough. I don't think our insights have fed into scholarly or analytical work in the way I would like, but I think that's really important. At the political level, I think I've been, if not surprised, continually disappointed at the degree to which these discussions, not just about anti-immigrant violence, but against ethnically based anti-outsider violence or other forms of violence against South Africans even, has not caught on in the way in which we talk about South African politics. The language of South African politics feels very much the same as it did 15, 20 years ago, even though we know so much more about what's going on. And while I understand why government doesn't want to talk about this, I would have expected much more from South African civil society, from activists and others who could use this work to really understand what is affecting most poor South Africans, the kind of governments that they de facto that they live under, the kind of hazards that they face. No one seems interested. And that, I think, is perhaps my biggest frustration.
Yeah. And I guess now my next question would be, I mean, within the center, within ACMS, there's so many projects as well that we focus on. And one of the projects that you're recently working on is the movement building, is it movement building for migrant rights project, right? And I just wanted to understand, because I see that there's some connections with the work that we do with XenoWatch. So in terms of the initiative that you're doing, how do you see XenoWatch building onto, or XenoWatch data helping with projects like the movement building for migrant rights initiative?
Yeah, I think our initial as a center, we started something as a group very aligned with the migrant rights movement and trying to ensure that refugees, asylum seekers, and then eventually other migrants and even domestic migrants had access to education, healthcare, housing, basic security, economic rights, etc. And we've worked over the years in many different ways to try to support efforts towards that end. Engagement with local government, engagement with national government, engagement with the IOM, UNHCR, and others. And of course, engagement with civil society to try to think through advocacy strategies. What can be done that will ultimately deliver a more secure, more inclusive society? I don't know that we've been hugely successful in that. I'm not sure what success would look like, but I think these new initiatives are ways of really recalibrating some of those efforts. Clearly, what we've done in the past, as I mentioned, hasn't caught hold, hasn't captured the imagination of South Africans, government, civil society, etc. And so the current initiative is really trying to look at strategies that might work and to support a movement that might make a difference, if not to solve these problems, at least to protect people in the short term.
Yeah, yeah. And I think my next question would be around data, because I think in this era where there's a lot of anti-migrant rhetoric and sentiments, we're working within a space where data doesn't mean anything, in terms of
How dare you?
Pardon?
How dare you say that?
Unfortunately, it feels that way because part of our work is producing evidence-based data that can inform policy and, interventions on the ground. But, just from my experience and more, you're seeing that even if you're showing the evidence that migrants don't make up a majority of the population, evidence from XenoWatch that this is going on a daily basis because of the denialism that we see sometimes with politicians, right? It's not really translating to the change that we want to see. So I think for me, the next question would be, we are working in a project where part of the work that we do is producing data. And it is important. It is important, and I say it in terms of informing policy, in terms of informing interventions. So now within this climate that we're working within, how would you say we can, I don't want to say better use our data, but how can we ensure that our work is relevant in terms of ensuring that advocacy strategies and grassroots mobilizations on the ground who are focused on fighting xenophobia become effective?
It is a difficult time for people who are committed to evidence-based policymaking, advocacy initiatives of any kind. That's as true in South Africa as it is in the United States, Australia, or many other countries, where facts themselves are being stigmatized, where people who rely on methods of grounding their statements in an empirical reality are seen as out of touch. And I think that means two things for us, or at least, if not three. The first is that we must continue to do this, because otherwise it is fully surrendering to the idea that there are many truths, not many versions or interpretations, but actually many different truths. And we have confronted that over and over, where we have presented data and simply been dismissed because someone has seen differently in one place with their own eyes. But I think it also means that we need to understand how people react to that data, what sort of stories they tell themselves about us, about what's happening, and to think about where those narratives are coming from and how we might engage or better unsettle those narratives that continue to naturalize violence and exclusion against foreigners or others. And that, I think, is the next step for us, right? Is to reflect on the frustrations we've had that you spoke about between presenting what we would see as facts and the way in which our own presentations are understood and the alternatives that are presented. And we need to think about how we craft different narratives that are fact-based, of course, but can somehow find their way in to political debates at all of these different levels. And I think we've been uniquely bad at doing that. The migrant rights narrative, the refugee rights narrative in South Africa has not done that, and in some ways has become a point of argumentation and pushback. So it is now incumbent on us not to wait for others to see the truth, to applaud us for incredible data that we've collected, but to think about how we tell the stories based on that data in very different ways.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, as you highlighted, I mean, not only for South Africa, but I think globally, it's just an interesting time to work within the migration space at the moment. So with that being said, looking ahead, and with all these, some of these challenges and reflections that you highlighted, where do you see the project going? What impact or where do you see the relevance of the project within the bigger space of migration and in terms of tackling xenophobia within South Africa? Yeah, where do you see us landing there?
Yeah, I don't think there's a landing in the sense that it can ever stop. This is an evolving field. Obviously, the issues of African migration, when we started this, it was something that concerned South Africa, it concerned us, but is now something of global interest. We've seen the European Union spending billions of euros trying to stop Africans from moving and engaging in this space. We've all been distracted by other things in the last few months, but this issue will continue to be at the center, I think, of how societies are being remade. Cities are growing very quickly. People are forming lives across multiple spaces. Countries neighboring South Africa are either at war or in conflict or will continue to send people into this area. So the need for this kind of work is not going anywhere. What does that mean for us? I think that is an open question. It definitely means we need a new generation of people who can carry this forward, can take the messages forward. It means reaching out into different ways. Academic publications are our bread and butter, but they don't reach the public. We need to think about new ways of engagement. And I think we do need, oddly, despite what you say, that people don't want data or need it or respect it, I think it actually means we need to expand this kind of work, to think comparatively, to really develop this as a foundation for those now or in the future who recognize the challenges that come from different sorts of people living together, struggling together, from the politics that emerges from that, and ultimately, for us to survive as people who live in this part of the world, we're going to need to address those sorts of issues. And hopefully the work that we do will remain a relevant resource for people who are genuinely committed to doing that.
Thanks, Loren. So I think another question I wanted to ask you is, what would you think is urgently needed by the project right now? What is the most urgent thing that we should be focusing on as XenoWatch to level up?
This is a question many of us will need to ask each other. Clearly, beyond the finances, which we need to simply survive and continue to do the work, I do think we need to ensure that our data collection is as good as possible. But what we haven't done is use that work that we've already collected, the data we've collected, to maximum effect. And I think some of that is ensuring that the data and all of the work are available to scholars and to activists. But beyond just doing the analysis, to ensure that those stories that come from that reach different audiences. And I think what's critical now is that we think through different ways of engaging the public at multiple levels, whether it's civil society in a township or informal settlement or the UN. And I think these are issues that are facing South Africa acutely, but they're also facing the continent more generally. And I think in the long term, what I would like to see is that this become part of a comparative network with people studying and doing similar methodologies in multiple countries, destination countries or migrant-rich countries, and that we start to have these conversations at a regional level about what does living with diversity in very informal spaces where the law doesn't have a huge effect on people's rights or welfare. How do we start understanding what's going on? But ultimately, how can we intervene to make people's lives better? Because there will be millions of people, tens of millions of people living in these kind of conditions in the years ahead. And one of the things we've realized is we just know very little about what their lives are like on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for people who are learning about the Xeno, you said a mouthful. I think what is the one thing that you think anyone listening to this should take away from about xenowatch? Like, if someone should think about xenowatch from listening, what is the key takeaway that you'd want them to walk away with?
I think that it is a tool for understanding an emerging reality that will shape the lives of millions of people, not just foreigners, not just migrants, but everyone who is living in a community that is being shaped by difference, diversity, and movement. And in the years ahead, that will be almost every community.
Yeah. And in parting, how can people support and engage with the xenowatch project?
Well, they want to support us. That can take multiple forms, of course. We always have our hat in front of the door ready for donations. But I think people who want to use the data are welcome to be in touch. People who have incidents or places they think we should be concentrating on, to please let us know. But we're also welcome partners, scholars, civil society organizations, and others who might be able to use our data or our analysis to try to support programs that are aimed at building a more inclusive future.
Great. Thank you so much, Loren. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.